Thanks for clicking on THTC. Today we're going to take a look at latency and try to figure out what the best latency is for an Apple Silicon Macintosh. If you're the kind of person that just wants an answer, in my estimation it's 64 samples. But anyways, we'll take some measurements and see what we get from there. Okay, we're going to use MOS for all this. It's just a convenient way to get an impulse response and measure latency. The gray channel is just a straight loop back. The audio interface inputs is connected to the output, and we're measuring 9.25 milliseconds latency. Let's throw up a text pad here. So there we go, 9.25 milliseconds latency. Let's turn on a microphone channel. The microphone channel needs a little bit more gain, and it's currently just picking me up. So let's give it some audio. There we go. Hopefully that's not too annoying. Typical MOS, and I don't know. We'll knock this up to 32K just for fun. There we go. It's a little slower, but whatever. Okay, so currently we're measuring 9.25 milliseconds latency on the loopback channel and 10.56 on the microphone channel. And numbers to the right are basically the number of samples. So right now it's 507 samples of delay. If I subtract out the 64 sample block size I'm currently using, that gives me a samples of 443. So I can change the block size real easy over here, as long as sampling and everything else. So if you go from 64 samples down to 16 samples, that's a difference of 48 samples. And since we're running at 48 kilohertz, that should be the difference of 1 millisecond. But first, before we do that, let's just move the microphone so we get about 11 milliseconds here. That's about here. Okay. So now when we go down to 16, we expect it to drop by a millisecond. Well, almost a millisecond. I guess my thing's a little off. But anyways, 10 milliseconds, so we're at 480 milliseconds. Now, if I subtract 16, that's the same 464 samples of latency here. And it really doesn't matter. It's going to be 464 no matter which way I go. Now, 32 samples is an additional 16 samples, so it's 10.33. Everything seems to make sense. Now, the additional latency we're measuring in here, since the gray channel is just a straight loop back, it doesn't really go through microphone. The additional 379 samples of latency is caused by various things. First off, my program and everything like Ableton and everything else communicates with a program called Core Audio, which basically communicates with the USB specification to send audio through a USB. And then once it gets over to the interface has to decode the USB, turn it into a new stream of audio, and everything else. It's a lot more complicated than that. I can go into detail, but nobody really listens. Nobody really watches this stuff anyways. So anyways, here's the interesting thing that I noticed. If you go to 16 or 64, that makes a lot of sense. But if you go to 128, now it didn't jump up by, what did that be, 64 samples, which would be 1.33 milliseconds, but it jumped up by 4 milliseconds or 3? Jumped up by 4 milliseconds. And you can see the latency also increases over here. So anything above 64 samples seems to add additional latency into the everything below me, basically. So you can basically go to 64 samples, and you get quite a bit of extra latency from everything else in the system. So going to 16 samples is a lot harder on the CPU, but it really doesn't give you that much of a benefit. It gives you exactly 1 millisecond of benefit. But if you go down to 128, now all of a sudden you're getting a lot more latency in here, and you get, rather than 1.33 milliseconds latency, you get an additional 4 milliseconds, which is pretty significant. Let's change the sample rate, see what we get on different sample rates. Well, let's kick it up to 192 really quick. Now, for some reason, I don't know why, but this is pretty weird. But for some reason, you have to hit the audio twice. The first time through, it gives me more latency. Now I click it again, and now I'm down to 6.88. And that's pretty consistent across here. Now, I mean, I change the audio rate as fast as I can. Maybe that has something to do with it, but it's somewhere in car audio or the device driver from core audio to the USB. There's a lot of software in between here. But anyways, let's connect this to, I don't know, maybe 7 milliseconds. See if we can get to 7. About here. Okay, now since we're running 4 times the rate, we should only gain a quarter millisecond when we go to 16, which is exactly what we see. You can see here the delay is 1280. If I subtract out the block size, it's 1280. It doesn't really matter. Anything that's a multiple of 2 below 64 samples will give me about 1280. Now, if you go to 48 kilohertz, it doesn't quite work out that way, and you get something different. But anyways, I see the same thing. So we're a little off here. We'll move this thing back to 7 milliseconds because that's just the way it is. So if you notice there, the difference between, I mean, that should be less than a millisecond, but it's actually giving us a millisecond of change. Let me go from here. So it's kind of the same deal where 64 samples seems to be a sweet spot. Anything below it, you're just getting a couple samples at less latency. If you go above that, it gets quite a bit higher.